The President, please be seated. The court is now back in session. We now would like to hand over to the prosecution to continue putting questions to Mr. Hedder.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, so far today, I've been discussing this book, but none of you have been able to see it on the screen. I think it might help everyone in the court if the AV unit can now pull up the extracts that I'm referring to so that the information is available for everyone. Can I please make that application?
The President, AV Booth, can you advise the Chamber whether this document can be put up on the screens as requested by the co-prosecutor?
Mr. President, we have all these items already. It's just a matter of switching the screen so that they can be displayed.
The President, AV Booth is now directed to put up this document on the screens.
To assist the AV unit, or everyone, it's E3/22. And the next page I'm moving to is English ERN 00393-765. Mr. Hedder, page 102. We're still in the 1960s, and the quote is towards the bottom of this page. Thus, urban protest and peasant unrest against the Sankum regime broke out in 1966 and intensified in early 1967. This created possibilities for the Kampuchea Workers' Party to organise opposition, either directly or via Khieu Samphan and other dissident intellectuals amenable to its views, through whom the party continued to try to project influence and the image of a Cambodian revolution led by French-educated doctors of philosophy. Footnote 14, in short form, quotes Pol Pot Presents. The long title is Pol Pot Presents, the Cambodian Party's Experiences, to Kampan, the Secretary General of the Communist Party of Thailand, in formal talks held in August 1977. A document from the Vietnamese archives, translated into English by Thomas Engelbert and Christopher Gosha, from a Vietnamese translation of the Khmer original. Can I ask Mr. Hedder how you came into possession of this document?
That was given to me by Chris Gosha. Can I, the mystery document, I can now say who I think this is an interview of, if this is an appropriate time to deal with that issue.
And so who is this person, do you believe?
This is an interview with someone. Can I say the name? Or how do I do this? I can tell you I know who it is. Maybe there's another venue in which I can say I think the person is.
Do you know if the person's still alive or deceased?
Actually, no. The person whose name is on the document is actually deceased. The person whose name was on the other similar document that you showed me, whose name we didn't mention, is in fact also deceased. As it happens, the person whom this is in fact the interview of, I'm not sure whether he's dead or alive.
Mr. President, can I suggest that Mr. Hedder writes down the name of this person and passes it to the greffier, and then to certainly to us, please.
The President. Yes, you may proceed, and Mr. Hedder, you may write it on a piece of paper and have it handed over to the co-prosecutor, and court officer is now directed to take this name written by the witness to the prosecutor.
Mr. President, what I'm going to suggest is we will now email everybody so that they have this name. Can I ask Mr. Hedder what position this person held, or just a little bit more information about this person?
As he says in the interview, he was a district secretary in Sector 22 of the East Zone.
Thank you. Can we continue with page 102? I'm following on from footnote 14, and I quote, "In accordance with the KWP tactic adopted for the 1962 elections, underground KWP networks worked hard to ensure Khieu Sampon's re-election in the next ballot in September 1966. The party also helped Hu Nim, but not Hu Yuen, during a campaign in which all three had to compete against against other Sankum candidates backed by Sihanouk." The footnote, number 15, I'd like to read. In Sopiep, Khieu Sampon, pages 72 to 73, who quotes Sampon as indicating he was very reliant on this assistance, and notes that Hu Nim was the more dynamic campaigner. Khieu Sampon's constituency was in southern Kandal province, in what was then a part of the East Zone, but bordered directly on Takiev province in the southwest zone. The underground networks of both zones supported his campaigning activities. And then just these words: interview with a former Communist Party member from Prek Kaba district, Takiev province, sector 13, southwest zone. We know about Impopi. Does just giving you this bare information about an interview with a former Communist Party member help at all, or not?
Not without access to files that I only have somewhere in the UK.
I'd like next to move to a new chapter in your book. It's tabbed on yours with CONC towards the bottom to indicate conclusion. Can I check you have that chapter, and the first page of the chapter is 159. And the title of the chapter is Conclusion, People's War, Revolution and Popularity, 1970 to 1975. The first page that I'd like to ask you about within this chapter is on page 162, and the ERN in English that I'd like the AV to show is 003932825. This is talking about the period after the coup in 1970. I quote, "Within a month of the coup, the Vietnamese Workers' Party was in control of a swathe of territory 20 to 60 kilometres deep into Cambodia. Together with areas where the Lon Nol administration was paralysed, this created a liberated area with a population of 1 million. The VWP considered that this and Sihanouk's stance against the coup meant the Cambodian revolution was making a great leap forward, being well on the way to creating a revolutionary government." Footnote 27 refers to documents illustrating Vietnamese communist subversion in Cambodia. Document number 6, Base Area Meeting, Lieutenant Colonel, and can I spell his name because I'll pronounce it improperly, Nguyen, Van, V-A-N, Vang, V-A-N-G, B1924, Go Vap District, Gia Din, Giadinh, First EXO, SR2, brackets, Pike Collection, close brackets. Again, can you help us on the source?
The original of that document, which is a document obviously in translation from another document in Vietnamese. This is only the original document of the English translation. I think I have from two places. One is a collection of such documents given to me by one of my academic mentors at Cornell University in the 1970s, the late Professor George Cahan, who was given a collection of such documents by the U.S. Embassy in Saigon in around 1970 or 71. The second place, more accessible, is the collection of Vietnam War-related documents at Texas Tech University, which inherited the documents collected by Douglas Pike, who was an American official in South Vietnam during the war period, who collected all kinds of bits and pieces of paper, and when he died, he bequeathed them to this collection.
Thank you. Page 163, English ERN to show 003932826, talking about 1970. A Q Sampan communique, making no mention of the Vietnamese, declared that the Cambodian people's struggle to set up people's power was spreading vigorously as the Cambodian National Liberation Armed Forces developed quickly, attacking 12 provincial capitals, liberating 4 of them, many district capitals, and hundreds of villages. Footnote 32. 20th of June 1970, communique by the Ministry of National Defence of the Government of the National Union of Cambodia, VNA, 29 June 1970. I think I know the answer, but VNA, and how did you obtain this?
VNA, Vietnam News Agency, was the successor to VNS, Vietnam News Service. So it's the official news agency of the then still Democratic Republic of Vietnam. And material of that sort was collected and is held in the Cornell University libraries.
Continuing on from footnote 32, in August 1970, Funk claimed that its armed forces had wiped out 80,000 US Lon Nol and Saigon enemy troops and completely liberated 5 provinces of Cambodia. Footnote 33, New China News Agency, 7 August 1970, citing the Funk Information Bureau. Again, just a little bit about New China News Agency.
New China News Agency is the official news agency of the People's Republic of China.
Continuing on with the next sentence, in September 1970, it said it controlled nearly 3 of Cambodia's 7 million people. Footnote 34 references 17 September communique of the Political Bureau of the NUFK Central Committee and the Royal Government of National Union of Cambodia, New China News Agency, 7 August 1970. It was the Political Bureau of the NUFK Central Committee. Can you help a little bit on that?
Formally speaking, the National United Front of Kampuchea, which was the ostensibly and in many ways, in fact, non-communist political organization backing the Royal Government of National Unity of Kampuchea, was headed by a central committee, and above the central committee was a political bureau. So it was organized as if it was organized along Communist Party lines, but it was in fact not a Communist Party organization.
Thank you. Page 164, English ERN 00393827. Extract, I quote. The CPK began in 1971 formally to demand the Vietnamese dissolve and turn over its control the armed forces and political structures they had organized in Cambodia, especially in the east and southwest zones where these were most numerous. 45, the Black Paper, Facts and Evidence of the Acts of Aggression and Annexation of Vietnam against Kampuchea, Phnom Penh, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, September 1978. So again, just how you sourced that, or this reference to Black Paper.
I mean, in this instance, it's a full academic citation to that publication, which in its English version was disseminated in the United States by the same GK Ram organization I previously mentioned.
Do you know where it was printed?
It looked like, to me, the version that reached me had been printed in Phnom Penh.
Next, it'll be the bottom of page 165, moving into page 166. ERN English 00393828. As late as the end of 1972, the CPK again fell back on Vietnamese military intervention to defeat key Lon Nol offensives. Footnote 57, Engelbert and Gosha falling out, page 116. That's another academic, is it a book or an article? I don't know if Mr. Hedder's microphone can come on, please.
There it is. Yeah, that's an academic publication.
Carrying on with the same page. And as late as August 1973, Vietnamese special weapons units assisted CPK attacks, again Engelbert and Gosha. Nevertheless, throughout 1972 and into 1973, the CPK pursued its goal of getting Vietnamese troops to evacuate its liberated zones. In some places, it managed to negotiate their departure, but where the negotiations failed, it organized the population to demonstrate against them or launched military attacks on them. By the end of 1973, they were gone from most CPK-controlled areas. Footnote 59 references Matsushita interviews, number 15, 18, 23, and 30, describing events in the east, southwest, and special zones. We're going to come to some of the refugee interviews. You've already touched upon these with Matsushita. It's the same interviews, I take it.
Yes, it's drawn from that collection of typed up versions of interviews done in February, March 1980 under the auspices of Kyoto News Service.
Now, in terms of this withdrawal of the Vietnamese from Cambodia in 1973, aside from the 1980 Matsushita interviews, have you been in possession of, seen, considered, had other interviews that support the fact of the Vietnamese withdrawal at that time in these circumstances?
For once, the short answer, yes.
A short expansion?
There are other interviews which I did in the period between 1978 and 1984, which I'm sure there are interviews that I did, other additional interviews in that period. over that period that touch upon this issue. I don't think any of that material is on the case file, not to my knowledge. In addition to that, another, at least potentially lucrative source is the various memoirs, blogs, and other old-fashioned print published materials and digitally disseminated materials written by Vietnamese communist military veterans who served in Cambodia in this period and have discussed what happened in those books, those memoirs, those blogs, those chat rooms, and so on.
I'd like you to concentrate on the interviews you conducted on this subject. First question, can you remember the sorts of people, or is that too simplistic a question, that you interviewed who gave information about this subject?
Yes, is the short answer, and the brief elaboration. There's a series of what one might call quantitative interviews that I did in 1980 and 81, if I recall correctly, that led to some statistic-like data that has been part of the basis for some of the estimations of the mortality that occurred under the Khmer Rouge regime. Quoted by, or used by Ben Kiernan, quoted or used by Patrick Piverline, and others. And if I recall correctly, there were some maybe 1,500 of those interviews, which it also tended to include some very basic biographical data. And when I looked at the basic biographical data, I sometimes thought to myself, that person would be interesting to talk to in more detail, to do a qualitative interview. And normally what that meant was that there was some indication to me that the person was probably a cadre, someone in a position of authority who would have some inside knowledge or relatively high level and detailed knowledge of what had happened.
If I ask you to go on the internet tonight or do whatever research you can, is there any possibility that if I came back to this subject tomorrow about the 1973 Vietnamese withdrawal, that you may be in a position to pinpoint any particular interviews that you had? I can see you shaking your head. Now, can I please move to page 167 for you, ERN English 00393830. A portion in the middle of the page, I quote, "Inside Cambodia, the CPK kept Grunk Minister of Propaganda Hu Nim and Minister of Interior Hu Yuan under virtual house arrest. While exploiting their names in propaganda, they sometimes wrote themselves that still gave the impression that they were leaders of the revolution. Unofficially, however, Hu Yuan was openly critical of the CPK, its leadership and policies. Hunim agreed with him, but was more circumspect and sycophantic. Footnote 69. Pung Se interview, Steve Hedder's interview with Pung Se, Phnom Penh, 25 July 1999. So again, to confirm the source, and just a little bit please about interview Pung Se and a general description of him and his position, or how he fits in to the overall picture.
Pung Sawi was one of the first generation of Cambodian communists, same generation as Pol Pot, same generation as Ieng Sary, and so on. If I recall correctly, also had a sojourn, an educational sojourn in France, came back, was part of the Communist Party organization inside Cambodia, either shortly before or immediately after the 1954 Geneva agreements, and then was a member of the Phnom Penh party apparatus, underground party apparatus, in the post-Geneva period. We're talking about the mid to late 1950s, and then fell out with the Communist Party, or kind of lapsed from membership, but continued to be a kind of leftist politician. And then after the change of government in 1970, went into the Maquis, and was at the party, the complex of offices that constituted the party headquarters in the Maquis, and was in touch with his old friends, in some senses his old comrades. And after 75, worked at the Ministry in the Democratic Kampuchea Ministry of Education. Survived. Also spent some time in prison under the People's Republic of Kampuchea after 79. Survived, and eventually re-emerged and worked for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights.
I'm slightly frightened every time I ask you a question how long the response is going to be. But can I just go to this part of the extract? Hu Yun was openly critical of the CPK, its leadership and policies. Is the source for that only Pung Se, or can you help us on any other sources that support the statement of fact that Hu Yun was openly critical of the CPK?
Not off the top of my head. I can say that it's one of those things that is widely said, widely asserted, but to find somebody who was actually there and actually heard it, I'd have to think about it some more, and is still alive, is a bit, doesn't immediately pop to mind.
I'm moving on, same page, after footnote 69. The even more compliant Grunk Deputy Premier Khieu Samphan was the odd man in. He'd been rewarded for his submissiveness by promotion to alternate Central Committee membership, footnote 70, and that references Khieu Samphan's open letter to my compatriots, 16th of August 2001, and your it says interview with Steve Hedder. We'll come to that later. In terms of the year that your research or documentation or interviews has yielded, Can you tell us what your understanding is of what year Khieu Samphan was promoted to Central Committee membership?
Alternate, alternate or full?
Alternate.
My understanding is 71.
Continuing with the extract, referring to Khieu Samphan, and a post working as a kind of personal secretary to Nguyen, although even he had no independent decision-making power. Footnote 71 states, Tion Prasit interview of Tion Prasit, New York, 8 September 1997. First question, was that an interview you had with Tion Prasit?
Yes.
I'm interested in the phrase, post working as a kind of personal secretary to Nguyen. Can you help us on what Tion Prasit actually said, or is it too long ago? Please comment, and if you can help us.
Without seeking out the notes and hopefully finding them, I can't be absolutely sure how much I may have paraphrased what Prasit said. I suspect he said something very similar to that, but I wouldn't swear to it, to coin a phrase.
Still on this page, bottom of page 167, quote, although the CPK would for the most part steadfastly deny it, its victory was due in large part to unwelcome Vietnamese assistance of 1970 to 1972. Vietnamese armed intervention and political and military organisation and training provided the shield behind which the CPK developed its strength, and also many of the cadre and forces that became part of that strength as the CPK took them over. Footnote 72, Carney, unexpected victory, pages given. That, I take it's another academic source. Or again, can you explain?
It's an academic publication by a U.S. government, State Department political officer who was in Cambodia 71, 75 or thereabouts, and followed Cambodia from outside Cambodia after 75.
Thank you. Page 168. English ERN. On the screen, please. 00393831. Quote, already in late 1970, early 1971, the Vietnamese Workers' Party, while it remained predominant, and the CPK as it took control, increasingly relied on the pressure of their armed power to maintain and extend their control. Where the Vietnamese military operated in overwhelming force, it sealed off the liberated zones from the rest of the country. Footnote 75, reference David Brown on Vietnamese Communists, 1971. Can you help on that source?
I believe that's one of the documents that's in the Vietnam collection at Texas Tech. Probably part of the Douglas Pike collection, but it might be cataloged in a different manner.
Thank you. Continuing with the sentence about the Vietnamese military. Enforcing a ban on population movements between them, in other words, between the liberated zones. Reference 76. It's got H7 forwards the July 1970 resolution adopted by the Current Affairs Committee of CL2 to Agencies for Study and Execution, 19 July 1970 brackets Pike collection, the same collection you've already covered. Many rural folk felt trapped in the liberated zones, reluctantly acquiescing to communist control, whether Vietnamese or Cambodian. Footnote 77 references two things. David Brown on Vietnamese communists we've covered. But secondly, Cambodian Star, formerly an enemy captive, says that peasants are joining the Reds. New York Times, 2nd November 1970. So I obviously take it you saw the New York Times and referenced that to this event. Is that correct?
Correct.
They fled when they could. Footnote 78 is the same document that we've just covered from the New York Times. No, sorry, forgive me. Peasants flee Red control in Cambodia, the Los Angeles Times, 3rd of January 1971. And Montagnards who fled Cambodia get little aid, New York Times, 10 April 1971. Are those correct footnote references?
I presume so, yes. And all of those kinds of materials were also were collected by the Cornell University Library and bound there, so they should be sitting there in the bowels of that university library.
Talking of the people fleeing, and I carry on with a quote. In context, fled from a revolution that enjoyed even less popular support than that in southern Vietnam. Footnote 79 references Why Cambodia Didn't Fall, Christian Science Monitor, 10 November 1970. Is that correct?
Same answer, yes, correct, and presumably from the Cornell University Library collection.
Moving to page 169, English ERN 00393-832. Quote, as the CPK became more politically autonomous of the VWP in 1971-1972, much of the population remained, quote, cynical, distrustful and fearful, close quote, of a revolution that maintained its position through threats and executions. Footnote 83. References. A U.S. Central Intelligence Agency Intelligence Information Report. Khmer Communist educational and indoctrinational activities in Bante Sray district, Siem Reap province, Khmer Communist Detention Camp at Rolus, Siem Reap Province, for civilian offenders, 6 June 1972. How did you please access this report?
Not to speak ill of the dead, but the late Douglas Pike often had access to classified material which he put into his public collection through what's known as field declassification. That means you cut off the bit at the top, you cut off the bit at the bottom, and you put it out there where others can read it. So I think this material almost certainly is in the Texas Tech collection of Vietnam War era documents.
Thank you. Continuing. As the CPK expelled Vietnamese armed forces in 1972-73, it replaced their military domination with increasingly extreme coercion to ensure peasant compliance with its demands. The CPK became even more violent and repressive after mid-1973, and I read on, when it radicalized its policies, insisting on the formation of agricultural cooperatives in the zones under its control, curtailing the practice of religion, imposing even stricter prohibitions on villagers' movements, and mobilizing the population for attacks on Phnom Penh. Footnote 84 about coercion references Donald Kirk, Revolution and Political Violence in Cambodia, 1970 to 1974, in Joseph J. Zasloff and McAllister Brown, Communism in Indochina, New Perspectives. Firstly, who was Donald Kirk?
Donald Kirk was an American war correspondent active throughout Indochina during what we call the Second Indochina War. That is the one that ended in 1975. I believe he's still alive. He's a journalist now in Korea.
Another portion on the same page. The CPK never convinced the majority that the revolution it was pushing forward was in their interests. Coercion, force, and threats maintained only the semblance of mass support and of the popular success of the National People's Democratic Revolution. Reference Frierson, Revolution and Rural Response. Who is Frierson?
It's Kate Frierson, who did a PhD with David Chandler, and I believe this passage is taken from her PhD, although there was a published article based on her PhD, which may be what I'm citing.
I want to go back, as I've neglected to speak about footnote 85, which is about, in part, mobilizing the population for attacks on Phnom Penh. And your source for that, Kenneth M. Quinn, Political Change in Wartime, The Khmer Krahom Revolution in Southern Cambodia, 1970 to 1974, Naval War College Review, Spring 1976, Kiernan, How Pol Pot Came to Power, and Frierson, Revolution and Rural Response. You've explained Frierson. We know Kiernan. Who was Kenneth M. Quinn?
Ken Quinn was a U.S. Foreign Service officer, based, if I recall correctly, in the U.S. consulate in Con Tua in southern Vietnam, from which he did political reporting, including reporting based on what he was told by Cambodians who came from Cambodia into Vietnam. And this article was based on what they used to call an airgram, which was a report that he sent back to either to the embassy or to Washington, and he later got governmental permission to publish it as a journal article.
Thank you. Sorry. One of the references is Ben Kiernan, How Pol Pot Came to Power, pages 368 to 393. You should have in one of your next tabs, I hope, extracts from Ben Kiernan. Can you confirm whether that is in your file or not? Can I explain, please, Mr. President and Your Honours? These documents have been presented already to you by me in a document presentation. They are extracts from E3/1815, and I want to summarise them and ask Mr. Hedder some questions. Mr. Hedder, can I take you to the second page in your pack now, which should be page 369 of Kiernan, English ERN, and I wonder if this can go up on the screen, 004874889. The Khmer is 00104869. This part not available in French. I'm going to try and summarise, if we may, Mr. Hedder. It's talking about 1973 and the evacuation of Kratche. Now, from your research, studying documentation, interviews you conducted, did you come into possession of information or facts that can help this court on the evacuation of Kratche in 1973?
The President, Mr. Witness, could you please hold on, and counsel, you may now proceed.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'm not entirely sure if Mr. Hedder himself is aware of this, but he is in the midst of slipping from his capacity of testifying as a witness to that of an expert based on the questions being put to him by the co-prosecutors, in spite of the cosmetics that adorn his questions. He seems to be referring to certain documents and asking the witness questions as though he were an expert. We are all very well aware, despite what our opinions are, we are all very well aware that Mr. Hedder is appearing before this court as a witness and not as an expert. The purpose of his testimony is to provide indications on the method with which he conducted his work before his work at the tribunal. He is potentially testifying as though he were an expert, and I object to the questions being put to Mr. Heder.
I haven't asked one question about opinion. I'm not going to ask one question about opinion because you've given your directions. I'm not asking his opinion about Kratje. I'm asking him, did he, through his research and his interviews and documents he's seen, I'm not asking him what his opinion is. And can I add this, because I think it's important. Already Mr. Heder's made it clear. He's conducted many interviews that are not on our case file. And so in my respectful submission, I'm perfectly entitled to ask him, based on his direct knowledge, interviews he has had, to quote the trial chamber's memo. Can I please proceed?
The President, the objection by counsel for Mr. Kyu Sompon is not sustained. The question the co-prosecutor put, or the questions put to Mr. Steve Heder are appropriate. Mr. Heder, you are now instructed to respond to the question.
Mr. Heder, can I repeat the question? Here, Kiernan's talking about the evacuation of Kratje in 1973. You've said already, I think, that you were in Cambodia 1973 to 1975. So perhaps I'll ask that first. Is it right that you were in Cambodia from 1973 to 1975?
Yes. If I recall correctly, from May of 1973, and I recall specifically until 11 April 1975.
Kratje, 1973, evacuation, help or no help?
Frankly, nothing leaps immediately to mind. If I looked in my old notebooks, I might find something, but there's nothing that's in the front of my mind that I can say to you with certainty, yes, I know there is something there.
Moving on to Kiernan page 371. English ERN 00487491. Khmer 00104870. No French. Kiernan 1973. Kampong Thom. Reference to the organisation was led by very severe men. Their discipline was terrible. There were many executions. Can you help? Kampong Thom, 1973, executions.
Again, off the top of my head, no. You might find something, however, in the work of previously mentioned Donald Kirk, who did some interviewing, as I recall, in Kampong Thom in 1974, which he either may have included in the article that you referred to or have written up in newspaper articles that appeared at the time.
Thank you. Kiernan, page 384. English 00487 504. Khmer 0010 487, I think 89. Can you pull up this page, please, on Kiernan, page 384. Udong, March 1974, talks about Donald Kirk investigating the aftermath. I don't want to lead in any way. Your interviews, your research, your books, your knowledge. Udong 1974. What happened? Can you help?
On this one, as it happens, I can. I went to Udong in the aftermath of this attack. I did interview some people who talked about the population being removed to the countryside. I also interviewed some people who said that there had been executions on the spot of some categories of people, including Buddhist nuns. And I have a pretty clear recollection of the state of those bodies. I certainly saw the bodies. I vaguely remember having seen maybe half a dozen bodies, but there were definitely bodies of women dressed as Buddhist nuns who had been killed there.
Did you see anyone dressed in uniform or a body in uniform? Or can you help on what may have happened to the Lon Nol soldiers?
I don't recall anything specific about. I certainly don't recall seeing any bodies of Lon Nol Khmer Republic military personnel. I may have been told that there were executions. I don't specifically recall that I was.
In terms of what you were told about executions in Udong, you've mentioned, I think you've used the phrase classes of people, and I understand the Buddhist nuns, but can you recollect, first question, what were your interviews viewees telling you about who had killed these people?
I think there was no ambiguity, at least in the minds of the people that I interviewed, that the executions were carried out by the Khmer Rouge troops who had entered Udong, killed certain people, and taken most, if not all, of the rest of the population out to the countryside.
How long after the 18th of March 1974, can you help, were you in Udong? Days, weeks, months?
I suspect it was on the 19th, the next day. It's close to Phnom Penh. It was relatively easy to get to. I went there right away. The recollection of the bodies is that they were fresh. So I think it was probably the next day.
Just roughly, population before the evacuation, population afterwards, or can't you help?
I don't have those figures in my head.
What was Udong like, the state of the town? in terms of buildings, I don't know, destruction, normal? Can you just paint a little bit of a picture for us? Udong, 19th of March, 1974.
My recollection is that the town was largely destroyed, very much shot up, that the pagoda on the top of the hill was also seriously damaged. The bodies of the nuns were actually on the hillside, on the way up to the top of that pagoda. Town itself was deserted, nobody there. Some Khmer Republic military had come into the area, but no local population, except for a handful of people, and those were the ones to whom I spoke, who had somehow managed to not get evacuated, had evaded the evacuation. And I think we're talking about, in that regard, dozens of people, certainly not hundreds, and absolutely not thousands. Several handfuls.
Were you able to ascertain where the evacuated people had gone to?
My recollection is west.
Can you help us on who had commanded the Khmer Rouge troops, either by name or by zone? In other words, which Khmer troops undertook this activity in Udong in March 1974?
Should be Special Zone Sector 15, probably Sector...
The President, Mr. Witness, could you please hold on, and Counsel Koppe, you may now proceed.
Mr. President, now we're passing exactly the zone or the border between being a witness and being an expert. The question was first, what did you see when you arrived there? Where did they go? Probably westwards. That is still within the realm of what a witness could have seen, could have heard. But the moment the question now comes as to who was the Khmer Rouge leader in charge of all this, is a typical expert opinion, and it's crossing that narrow border that we have all established. So I object to this question.
I agree. Can I ask the question in a different way? Did you speak to anyone? I don't want you to speculate. Did you speak to anyone, have discussions with anyone, obtain direct evidence from anyone about which troops had been involved without speculating?
The answer is certainly not at the time. In other words, presuming that I'm right, that it was the 19th, the next day, I wasn't in those days in a position to ask those kinds of questions, or even in a position to know to ask those kinds of questions. And the reason I phrased my answer the way I did is I'm thinking about what I know from other interviews that I subsequently did about who it was that was operational in those areas. Whether or not, by putting together the location with my information from my subsequent interviews, I can draw an inference. Whether there's, among those subsequent interviews, somebody that I had the good sense to ask this specific question of and got an explicit answer, yet again, I could only answer by going through all the notebooks and looking for it.
From my perspective, this is important. Now, we've already said there's lots of your interviews are not on our case file. I've asked you once already in connection with a different aspect. But is there any way that you would be able to identify material that assists the court on which troops undertook this activity overnight, into the next day? How long would you need? Is it feasible? Is it possible?
Let me try and explain about these 1978, 1984 interviews. First, of course, it's pre-digital. The way in which most of those interviews eventuated, I have described. I looked at the quantitative interviews with the minimal bio data, and then tried to track down, to try and follow up on cases that I thought were interesting. I have to say that this material was repeatedly offered to the court, first when I was in the office of the co-prosecutors, and second when I was in the office of the co-investigating judges, and there was no interest, or little or no interest would be a fairer, perhaps, summary. And the reason for that is that the assessment was that they were of, and I have to say this, I guess, they were of little or no probative value. And the reason...
I'm interrupting. I'm asking you a simple question.
No. The simple answer is no. It's not easy. It's not simple.
Right. Thank you. Now.
The President, thank you, Mr. Co-Prosecutor, and thank you, Mr. Witness. I think it is now appropriate moment already to have or to adjourn for 15 minutes. Court officer is now directed to assist Mr. Heather during this adjournment and have him return to the courtroom when the next session resumes at 3 o'clock, or rather 5 past 3.
សូមអញ្ជើញក្រោកឈរ